Let me start with the obvious. Sometimes life is hard. Right? Obvious? Thank you, Captain Obvious. That's a phrase I like, Captain Obvious, because we say sometimes some various obvious things as if we're the first ones to discover them. And it dawned on me this week, or I guess I discovered this week, something that is a disturbing truth. It's a truth. It's a true thing. Whether it's a truth, it remains to be seen. But I discovered this week that anesthetic is less than 100 years old. Think about that. I've had 9 heart surgeries, right? Not counting kidney stones and tons of narcotics, all given to me in legal ways. Kidney stones and narcotics go well together. Nothing else goes with kidney stones, so I've tried. Nothing else works, right? But I've thought about that. I've even told stories and griped about how in one of my procedures I woke up in the middle of it. Oh, and I remember the doctor saying that panicked voice saying, "Don't let him move. Do not let him move. He cannot move." And I remember the nurse, I think, without ever having seen her face, I think if I heard her voice to this day, I would know who she is. But I remember her stroking the top of my head. This is nothing that you should ever attempt to do. I was incapacitated. And at the time, it was very comforting, probably because I was wearing a hairnet. There was no actual contact, my kind of contact. It's a no contact. But I remember her like petting the top of my head saying, "You're doing great. You're going to be fine. Doing okay." Just calming me. But I've thought about that. All of the agony that I've been spared because of anesthesia in some form. Less than 100 years old. It's not that long ago. You went into surgery in a complete different way. It's not like they just invented surgery 100 years ago. You can go back to ancient Egypt, 2,000 years before Christ, 4,000 years before Christ, and they show evidence of surgeries. Isn't that remarkable? Human history shows just how capable we are of dealing with pain. Yet modern history has shown how incapable we have become. And I'm not just talking about bodily pain. I admit, I eat aspirin like my life depends on it. Ibuprofen, whatever, carrying in sheets of drywall. My body just doesn't respond the way it used to back a few years ago. Now in my mid-40s, things run a little bit slower. And I watch some of you who are in your mid-not 40s, and I know there's no hope. It only gets worse. It only gets worse. And I'm thinking how incapable sometimes I am of dealing with my own pain now. How much worse is it going to be? But have you noticed, as a people, the smallest things seem to derail us. I think we've lost our ability to suffer. And I'm not talking about not taking meds, dealing with bodily pain. I know people that are in extreme pain all of the time, and it's a horrible existence. So this has nothing to do with that. I'm speaking in large umbrellas, categories, that the smallest things happen and we don't know how to suffer anymore. We instantly move to anesthetize our own suffering. We want to medicate it away. Whether we do that personally, we do that by seeking our own medications, we instantly try to medicate away our suffering. Whatever that looks like. Maybe our medication is just checking out. I'm guilty. Life gets hard. I don't want to deal with it. Sometimes I spend my days dealing with everyone else's problems, and it turns out my home has the same problems your home has. And I can give you great advice and then go home and have no idea what I should do. Right? And it's easier just to turn the volume up on the TV. It's a medication. We don't suffer well, do we? And we come to these passages, you're like, well, what does this have to do with mountain climbing? Because we've been talking about mountain climbing. The glory of God, this is what we want. This is what I desire more than anything, is to see the glory of God. And the glory of God has descended on this mountain that stands in the middle of the plain. The Israelites have come out of Egypt, out of slavery. What do you have to gripe about? Oh, we find stuff. Right? They've come out of slavery. They're not quite in the promised land. They're in this in-between space, very much like us, right? We live in this in-between space where we have this victory in Christ, but we're still waiting for the return of Christ, and we turn on the news, and we still get headaches, and we bang our fingers, and bad things still happen, and here we are in this in-between. And it's like the wilderness, the plain in-between, this in-between space where the Israelites find themselves. And in their encounter in this wilderness with themselves, they have to encounter themselves. They encounter God as well. God shows up on a mountain, descends on the mountain. We read part of this, the thunder, the clouds, the lightning, the earth rumbling, the voice of God speaking, and the people are terrified. Nothing like this has been done before, nothing they had seen, and nothing since. All of God's people are gathered in one place, and God is speaking to all of his people at once. What a moment this must have been, but it terrified them. And they said, Moses, you just talk to God and tell us what God says. Rather than confronting the God that's a little frightening in this story, they would rather keep their eyes fixed on the plain before them than the mountain in front of them. The glory of God. But the glory of God is not in the plain. It's not back in Egypt where their empty bellies keep longing to go back to. It's not even in the promised land where Israel has not yet arrived. God's glory is there. It's present, but it's up this mountain. And the invitation is given. Initially, the invitation was to all. Approach the mountain. We read that a couple of weeks ago, approach the mountain. And Moses says, but God, you said no one is to even touch the mountain. And it's almost like they understood the commands of God. God had said, no one approach the mountain for 3 days. Consecrate yourself. The stains of Egypt are still on your garments. Wash those garments. Consecrate yourselves. Sanctify yourselves, we might say. You are a set-apart people. If you're going to approach the holy God, there needs to be some preparation. So he wasn't prohibiting them from ever coming up on the mountain, but it became a prohibition in their life. And so they were content to let Moses approach the glory of God. Because climbing mountains is hard. It requires something of us. It's arduous. Climbing mountains are difficult. Have you ever climbed a mountain? Not in Kansas. If you tell me about a mountain you climbed in Kansas, I'll call you a liar. Right? I'm from northern Illinois, which is close enough to Wisconsin, where my family is from, that we thought some of these big hills were mountains. I remember moving to Colorado Springs in 1987. First time seeing a mountain and seeing a mountain range. And then years later, I moved back in 1997. We moved from Colorado, my family. My dad moved us out there, then to Iowa, right on the Mississippi, so I was at sea level. And then that was my junior year of high school. Then sometime after my senior year and my first year of college, Jesus got a hold of me. I say finally got a hold of me. He had been trying for almost 20 years. It wasn't his dealing. It was my prohibition against him. Jesus got a hold of me, and I instantly knew I was called into the ministry. I knew it. And so I was going to go to the alma mater that my dad attended. So I moved back to Colorado to attend the Nazarene Bible College. And so here I was. I was new the second time to Colorado, and the mountains there in Colorado Springs, Cheyenne Mountain, NORAD, of course, Pikes Peak, these mountain ranges. And I had been out there 3 days. I had I had interviews lined up for later that week, and so I was looking for a job. I was staying with my sister. All of my belongings were in the back of my Superfly 3-cylinder green Geo Metro. Everything I owned was back there. I was cool even then. Who knew? But I had these job interviews lined up, and I was waiting for enrollment at school, and so I had this downtime, and I thought, as an Iowa boy moving to Colorado at over a mile high, you know Colorado Springs is higher than Denver, I thought, you know what's a good idea? I've been here 3 days. I'm certain I can climb a 14,000-foot mountain. Right? Isn't that a great idea? So one morning I had nothing going. I laced my boots and drive to the trailhead right there outside of Manitou Springs, and I come up to it and I tied up my boots. My boots, by the way, I was working loading docks, and so my boots were steel toe boots appropriate for a warehouse and forklifts and pallet jacks and stuff like that. And I saw the trailhead sign. It said 13 miles. Oh, that's for sissies, 13 miles. I can do 13 miles. It was 7 in the morning. I'll be up and down. It'll be 1 or 2 o'clock. I'll get home in time for Star Trek because I was that cool even then. And so this was the big plan. So I started out. I go a couple of miles. I get to bar camp, if you've been there. It's a camp without a bar. I was surprised. Got there, and I was like, this is easy. It was rolling hills, not a problem. And so I slowed down my pace because I was making everybody look bad. And not really. You're like, I don't know how to take that. And no, I just kept going. So 5 miles in, things are good. 7 miles in, okay. The trails changed a little bit. 10 miles in, something dramatic happens. You go, okay, I've only got 3 miles left. 3 miles. That's how fast we walk in an hour. 3 miles an hour. Cool. I can see my destination. There it is. And what I failed to recognize was trees had stopped growing at that point. Timberline. There were little bushy flowers real close to the ground, purple, very pretty, grown in between the cracks, but that was it. Occasional ground squirrel. No one else was smart enough to be there. 3 miles. And I came to a part of the trail that they called the 13 Golden Stairs. It's a lie. The only part of that statement that is true is the number 13, which, if I recall, is an unlucky number. Golden? No. Stairs? No. Switchbacks. Because if you were going to go to the point, the incline would be too much. And so you have to do this back and forth, 13 times above timberline, and I would walk 10 feet and rest 10 minutes. And my lungs would burn, my poor feet, my back. The boots had gotten heavy, and I'd sit down and I'd look at the trail and I'd think, if I just leave now, I'll still be good. It's all downhill. And I'd look down the trail and be like, yeah, I've made some progress. I guess I'll keep going. Look up. I can still see my goal. Okay, that's not that far. It's far, right? And you do this all the way up. Finally, you get to the top, and you're like, oh, I need a cup of coffee. That's the story of my life. I need a cup of coffee. Order the $6 cup of coffee. They can charge you. And order that $6 cup of coffee. They bring it to you in a styrofoam 8-ounce cup. It's like coffee shots. But it comes to you boiling hot, and you're like, oh, yes, hot cup of coffee. And here's this coffee literally in a rolling boil. And you sip it very carefully, and it's warm because the boiling point is so low. So you're drinking boiling hot, tepid coffee. Finally, I sat there for 20 minutes, and I was like, well, let's go back down. And you think, oh, this will be easy. Gravity's helping me. It helps. But after a while, every step down is felt in every joint, every thud. and my poor feet in my work boots, my toes jammed into the toes of that boot, blisters all along the side of my foot. I could feel the blood pooling in my boot. And I went to interviews later that week missing 5 toenails because of the damage of the downhill. Okay, what's the point of this story? First of all, it gives you a reason to make fun of me, because you sometimes don't just climb the mountain. That's what we talked about last week. You need to listen to the instructions. Listen to those that have done it. Listen to the voice of God. I hope you engaged in some of that silence this week. I hope it becomes a part of your life. I know it's hard. It is hard. But here's the point of the day. Climbing mountains is hard. It's hard. But here's the reality. You'll never get to the top of the mountain if you don't climb it. You want the glory of God? That's what it means, climbing the mountain. And it means that things have to be left behind. You discover on the side of the mountain what doesn't belong on the side of the mountain. Oftentimes, it's not till you're halfway up do you realize, I really didn't need to bring that along. And there it goes, one after the other. And here's what I want you to see, these verses that we're not dealing with verses in the way that it's kind of a theological walkthrough. A lot of times when we read Paul, we can do that because Paul has thoughts, and they're hard thoughts, but you can walk through it. This is a story. It's harder to do that. This is why we picked some of these verses, because you'll notice where God is in our story. He's in the thick darkness. He's hidden in the cloud. You see, so often we're looking for God in the green pastures, in the calm waters. We're looking for God where there's no troubles. And God says, no, all of the darkness that has kept you from seeing me, I'm right in the center of all of it. I think of that story of Jesus sleeping in the boat while the storm was going on. They kept looking at the storm, wondering when it's going to calm down. And Jesus was there the whole time, right in the center of the storm. This is where God is. It is right in the center of our darkness. And sometimes we want to find God while not having to look and wander into that darkness, because in the darkness, we learn something about ourselves, don't we? You see, if you will encounter God, here's the part we really don't like. You have to encounter you on the path. That darkness is yours. And God's in the center of it, which means you're going to have to navigate into that darkness. This is the way life is. Life presses us, doesn't it? It squeezes us. I could have read a whole nother set of verses about that, where we are pressed down but not crushed. We are broken but not destroyed, right? There's so many verses in the Bible about suffering. Literally take your pick and apply it. But we come to this, and here's what I want you to think. The way that life squeezes and presses, what comes out is not what life causes, but what life reveals. You take an orange. I love oranges. You take an orange, you squeeze an orange, you get orange juice. Why is it orange juice? Because it's an orange. Right? Okay, if you crush grapes, you get grape juice. If you press apples, you get, and if life squeezes Jeff, you get Jeff juice. Now that sounds disgusting. That sounds disgusting. And if you sit too close, you'll notice I tend to spit when I talk, so some of you have been baptized with Jeff juice. But this is what happens. When life squeezes us, what comes out is what's been there. Circumstances didn't cause it necessarily. It's been there. Oh, there are circumstances that cause things, but it's been there. And sometimes these things take up residence in our life, like darkness, like clothes that we wear, like garments that we keep putting on. These things take up residence in our life, and we can go through life when life is sailing in the calm. We can go through life just fine, as long as nothing is disturbed. It's like in here, when I make a big mess, as I did last week, and I'm going to do again this week, and you're going to help me do in a couple of weeks, if you walk away from the big mess, it all settles, and you can come in and it looks fine. But don't disturb anything. Because the second you disturb something, it's all going to appear. It's been there all along. There are things that leak out of our life when we are on the mountain that have been there, but we've got to deal with. So here's the question. When suffering hits, what do you leak? I know, we've been looking for God in places where there is no suffering. But that's not where God has taken up residence. He's taken up residence in the middle of our suffering. And here's what he's saying. As we climb the mountain, as the difficulty of the task is before us, and the things that we leak begin to be exposed, here's what God says. It's almost like he's saying, okay, so that's there. You go, yeah, that's there. Well, we don't need that anymore, do we? No. That's what forgiveness is. You see, you don't have to worry about all of these things when you're at the bottom of the mountain. You can accumulate, and you can just become spiritually fat and happy, complacent, sitting there, always grumbling about the leaders that aren't leading you up the mountain or into the promised land or back to Egypt or don't do this or don't do that. We become armchair quarterbacks, right? Where we have all the right answers, but we're not on the field. The field will always crush you. And when you get into the field, when you get on the side of the mountain, isn't it amazing how many answers go away? Because you've got to deal with the darkness. God dwells in the thick darkness. So what's the answer to some of this? How do you walk through it? Well, the first thing I want us to see is that suffering serves a purpose in our life. Now, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying God causes all suffering. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying God causes Russian tyrants to bomb out civilian apartment complexes. God doesn't cause that. I'm not even saying that God causes undersea earthquakes that create tsunamis that wipe out in Indonesia 100,000 people in one shot. The earth even convulses under the pain of its own brokenness. Creation is longing for what's in store. We sang that earlier. These are the evidence. I'm not saying God causes suffering. I'm not saying God causes a mutation on your chromosomes that create cancer in your body. God doesn't cause that. But here's what suffering does do. It becomes the place and the space where God allows the us that's not truly who we are to be revealed. All of these things we've accumulated. Suffering reveals them. Who you are reveals them. I've told the story of is hell year a right word? Dana? Yeah. I know 2020 was a hard year for the world, wasn't it? It was a really tough year for the Jews. I've given you bits and pieces of the story, and I'll do the same today. Someday, down the road, when time has moved us further, and wounds are not quite as gaping as they still are, Dana and I will be on the platform together having this conversation, and you'll get more of the story. But I remember in 2019, the year ended with a heart surgery. I'm getting older, and my body doesn't recover like it used to. And I was frustrated by that, and then I got sick and ended up in the hospital, a ER visit with an ambulance ride. And they kept drawing more blood than a vampire. And they could never tell what it was. Ironically, this was January of 2020. Ironically, I had all the symptoms of COVID, but COVID was not a thing. I don't know. Maybe that's what it was. I don't know. Maybe I'm the monkey at ground zero. It could be. I could be. I don't know. What I do know is after all that blood was taken, they found lymphoma, a latent mutation. And they said, oh, it's not as aggressive as it could be. We've got this treatment, this study. It doesn't require conventional chemo. Let's try this. I said, okay, it's a pill. It was a lousy pill, but it was better than chemo. And got to keep my beautiful head of hair. And we started going through it, and it was hard. COVID hit. My trial was defunded, and we were said, sorry. The church shut down. You were all part of that story. If you're part of that story, you know the visible parts, but behind the scenes, there's no right answers. I spent 2020 with someone mad at me constantly. We did the best we could. We made the best decisions we could. It was always the wrong decision on some count. And boy, it begins to affect you. And let me tell you, all of this was going on, and it did not exist without affecting my marriage. Dana and I went to marriage counseling in 2020. Not because we were losing our marriage, but because we were losing something in our marriage. You see, life squeezed me, and the Jeff juice that came out was ugly. But it revealed it. It didn't create it. Lymphoma didn't create it. COVID didn't create it. Heart problems didn't create it. It was all there. Life squeezed. And I started making a mess over everybody, over my whole life. You see, this is what suffering does. And here's part of the message today, is not how do you get over suffering. It's not it. It's to tell you how to suffer in the right direction. You know there's a way to suffer, and here's my second point in this. The first point is that if you're going to climb the mountain, there's going to be suffering. And even if you're not going to climb the mountain, there's going to be suffering, but it's going to ruin you. I watch in culture, suffering ruins people instantly. The smallest things. Have you ever met someone, the small thing happens, and they are ruined, and you're like, what is wrong with you? Buck up, sissy pants. Oh, you don't say that. I know that, but you think it because we've grown so incapable of suffering. So here's the first thing, is suffering's going to happen. It's going to happen on the plain where it ruins you, or it can happen on the mountain where it reveals you. What do you choose? I want to do it on the mountain, so that's the first thing. Here's the second thing, is make sure your suffering is pointing in the right direction. My mom this week, I found out after the fact. My parents were in Kansas City. My kid brother has been in the hospital. He's finally home, but he's not out of the woods. He has blood clots in his lungs. He had major surgery on his leg, and they were literally life and limb in a literal way. And the doctor said, we're going to save your life first and then worry about the limb. And even now, the limb is still in danger because his life is in danger. They're trying to dissolve clots while heal up a massive surgery to keep his leg. Huge. All from playing a basketball game. That's a side point. Don't play basketball. It'll kill you. But so my parents were down there. He has 4 little kids. And the youngest, Drake, is not even 2 years old. And my parents came down to help move kids around, school and everything. And his wife is a teacher, and so Carolyn was at work and trying to balance it all. So they were there just trying to help. And one day, I just found this out. My parents are back home finally, and my mom said, well, something happened. I was like, oh, great. She has a tendency to not say things. And she said, well, Drake was running. You know, we were in the hospital, and escalators. You play on escalators. That's what they're there for. Kids are going up the escalators, going down, right? The big circle. It's so much fun. We do it. I do it. Sometimes the kids do it. You know, it's fun. And so they were going up and down. Drake, not quite 2, took off. My mom, not quite 80, couldn't catch up. Right? You know how that works. And so he gets on that escalator. She follows quickly, and something happens. She goes down. Boom. And she can't stand up. She's bleeding. All this stuff. But all she's thinking about is watching Drake. He goes up. He doesn't care. My dad has the other kids, and he's going down the escalator. My mom's there. She sees him coming down the escalator on the other side, and in her mind, she's thinking, I've got to get down this escalator to meet him. Right? And someone else saw this, and they helped, but it's a stranger. Like, this is the world we live in. So she's got all this going on. Finally, my dad showed up. He shows up whenever it's convenient. Usually when it's inconvenient. Finally, he showed up, and he got a hold of Drake, and my mom, but my mom was still in this frame of mind where she had to get down the escalator. So she keeps trying to stand up and get down the escalator in the wrong direction. So to be where, because everyone was down here. And she says, my brain just wasn't working. I just couldn't, and I couldn't get up. And finally, she said, someone who saw all of this said, just write it up. She said, well, duh. Well, duh. And she's telling me this story, not knowing I was going to use her as a sermon illustration. And I thought, you know, how often do we fight our own suffering? I know you want pointers on how to suffer. I'm not sure I'm equipped because I've not done a good job. I'm not sure I'm an authority. I know there's verses in the Bible, and that's all I'll do. I can bring those verses out, and we read some of them today. But here's, I think, the lesson that I need to know is maybe we got to quit trying to suffer and just write it to the top. Because right in the midst of it is where God dwells, in the thick darkness, in the cloud. So here's a question for you today. Will you allow pain and suffering to transform you? Here's the thing. If it doesn't transform you, you will most assuredly transmit it. What doesn't transform you, you transmit. And the people around you begin to suffer, where Jeff juice begins to leak out, and everyone pays for it. Or it can begin to transform you, and you can write it up. This is going to stink, but I'm climbing a mountain, and there's expectations with climbing a mountain. Sometimes it's going to hurt. Sometimes I'm going to think about quitting. But occasionally I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to look down the path, and I'm going to look, and I'm going to see, look how far you've come, kid. Look at all of these little journeys you've had along the way. You've made it this far. And look up. There's your goal. How about 10 more feet? I know you may need to sit down again in 10 feet. That's fine. How about 10 more feet? How about one more step? Write it to the top. And when life squeezes, let that be the evidence of what is no longer needed on the mountain. And hear the words of Christ, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And as it squeezes out, let that run off the mountain where it's not needed. You see, it's not an accident that so much of how we speak about redemption and grace and mercy and the love of God comes to us through suffering. We eat this meal every week. We talk about the cross every week. We talk about the redemption that it brings all of the time. But there is no redemption if there is no suffering. Right? This cross was carried up another mountain, a mountain called a skull, Golgotha. It was carried, that cross was carried up, and the body was broken, and the blood was shed, because that kind of darkness, that kind of brokenness doesn't belong on the mountain. And there it died. And then later, the resurrection. That resurrection leaves everything that was shed on the mountain on the mountain. It leaves it in the place of the skull. And when new life comes, it brings something that is devoid of all of that old baggage. Do you need that? See, this is what I need in my life. I need that kind of suffering that produces life, that produces resurrection. I need it. So here today, will you keep trying to get off the escalator in the wrong direction? Or will you just ride it to the top? Because when you get to the top, what you find is a Savior, a cross, a redemption, a resurrection, and an ascension of a God who is still now very much in control.